Learning occurs in many ways: reading, writing, observing, and doing. Montgomery College's access to history is for the doers. Our guests have participated in actions or events that we now recognize as part of history. In the studio, they sit down, mic up, and have conversations with faculty and students from Montgomery College. There is no host, no flashy set, and no commercials, just people and their stories. Sometimes the stories date back many years, and sometimes the story is current. It's all historical, and it's part of Montgomery College's access to history.
In June of 1944, I was one of the young men who climbed down a cargo net and into a Higgins boat that landed on Omaha Beach during the invasion of Normandy as part of Operation Neptune. I didn't fire any weapon that day or any other day during the whole war, but I was awarded the Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts for what I did in Normandy. I'm Donald McKee, and I was a combat medic with the 29th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army during World War II. I was one of the few that served both in Europe and in the Pacific. I'm here to share some of those stories with you now.
Don, your hometown was Kalamazoo, Michigan. While you were attending University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, you had a draft deferment for being a college student. But you gave that all up. How did that transpire?
I graduated from high school in 1940 and knew I wanted to go to college. I was the first in our immediate family to be ready to do that, because this was the Depression years and nobody had any money to speak of. But of course the tuition rates were very small, and even at the prestigious university. So anyway, I enrolled, and when I had to register for the draft, when I was 18, I had to indicate that I was willing to serve. And as soon as I told them that I was enrolled in college in an engineering course, now, this wasn't for any college course. It was for those that were going to provide something that was needed for the country. And I was to have graduated in 1944 or 45. So I told the draft board that. Well, after a couple of years in the university, those that had no draft deferment were being called into service. And the only people left on the campus were the 4Fs, guys like me, and a wide variety of young ladies. I felt that, hey, I wasn't in the right spot for what I considered was my duty. So I decided on one of the weekends that I went from Ann Arbor, where the college was, back home, like once a month. I went into the draft board and said, I'm giving up my deferment. Well, they were shocked. And then I went on home that Saturday morning and told my parents, and they were triply shocked, but that was what my intention was. And within 2 weeks' time, back at school, I had the notice to report to the draft board. And I did, and was assigned to a basic training camp in Battle Creek, Michigan, Fort Custer. And it was in what was called a platoon, a bunch of around 50 or 60 that were mostly college students that had been put in and drafted. Well, at Fort Custer, when we were assigned to where we were going to take basic training, we were all put into medics. And when I found out about it, I said, oh my Lord, how in the world did I get into that? I'm training to be an engineer. I said, I could end up in some hospital somewhere as a taking care of sick people, and that's not what I wanted. So anyway, that didn't make any difference. So we were sent to Camp Grant, Illinois, the whole platoon, to medical basic training, and that lasted 18 weeks. And from there, then we were shipped. This is early 44 now, January, shipped to the port of embarkation in New York City, and were put on board the Queen Mary, which was one of the major ships of World War of that era, and were sent across to England. And we weren't in a convoy. We were all by ourselves on the Queen Mary. There were 17,000 troops on that ship, and it just went zigzagging like this, all the way across the Pacific, the Atlantic. And eventually all of us as medics were supplied to various infantry divisions that were waiting for the invasion of France, which was still going to occur in June of 1944. And I happened to be assigned to the 29th Infantry Division just before the D-Day, and that meant nothing to me. I had no knowledge of them at all, but as soon as I got with them a month before the invasion in May of 44, I learned that this was a gung-ho outfit that had been in England since the middle of 42, and this was their first fighting engagement. So I became a part, as a medic, of the 29th Infantry Division, and that was the National Guard for Maryland, D.C., and Virginia.
Originally, the plan was for your regiment to land on Omaha Beach on June 6th, but it was pushed back to the 7th, right?
The three regiments of the 29th Division, one was to come in at 6 o'clock in the morning, the one from Virginia, it did. The second one was from Maryland. It to come in at 10 o'clock in the morning on June the 6th. That did, but by the time we were supposed to come in as the 175th, the 2nd Maryland Regiment, the beach was so cluttered and was so bad, so much damage there, we couldn't even get in until the next morning. So no doubt that saved the lives of many of our regiment, because we couldn't get in until the 7th. We just sat out there until we finally were taken in, and as soon as we got ashore, we ran into the same problems that the other two regiments did.
How did you cross the English Channel for the invasion?
We came across from England 24 hours before we were supposed to land, and the idea was to stay out 6-8 miles in our English freighters that we went over on. And then on D-Day, Hagen's boats, as they were called, were loaded. They'd have nets down the side of these British steamers, or small inter-island type things, and we would climb down on these rope ladders, 2 or 3 at a time, and the landing craft were down against the side of the ship, down 15 feet or so below where we started off. And the weather conditions on D-Day were very, very against having a properly designed landing force, because the winds were very high. And this meant that the steamers would be in the water. That's the boat we came from England on. And the landing craft would come up on the side of it, and that landing craft would be riding the waves, and it would go up and down and up and down. Now the steamer would too, but not to the degree that the landing craft were, because they were a smaller boat. So we came down these rope ladders and were hanging on the side of the ship, and we'd look down, and the landing craft would be 15 feet below us. So we would have to wait until a wave came in and these things came up to where they were 3 or 4 feet below us, and then we would drop off the net and fall down into the landing craft. Well, we had to put 30 people on each of these small assault vessels, and that took a little while, but we eventually got them in. But the problem with our particular regiment, whereas the 1st Regiment of the 29th went in right away, and the 2nd Regiment went in about 3 hours later, and we, the 3rd one, were supposed to come in around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So the 3 regiments would have landed in a 6-hour time frame. But the beach, by the time we were ready to come in, was so cluttered with broken vessels and wounded people and such high winds that they decided, hey, my regiment, it's fortunate for me, but my regiment say, hey, you guys can't come in. There's no place to get you in the beach. So we would stay then on these landing craft that we were already on all night long until the next morning. Meantime, our mothership was with us, and we would stay and circle around all night long. And the next morning they say, okay, we've got sufficient places for your regiment. Now that regiment was 3,500 people, so there was a lot of folks that had to get in. We're ready for you the next morning, but down the beach a little bit. So instead of landing at this spot, they moved us down to where they had a little more space. The landing on the shore was an ordeal, but believe me, it was not anywhere near as bad as it was for the 1st and 2nd of our regiments that went in, who had to face the German. Because by the time the next morning came, a lot of those Germans had been knocked out, and the 2 regiments that went in before us were in a couple of 100 yards. So they didn't have anybody firing right down on the beach. That saved a lot of us in the 3rd Regiment. As soon as we got ashore, of course, and joined the other 2 side by side, our well-being was equal to theirs. So,
how far into the beach would the Higgins boats take you?
The tides were as much as 30 feet difference between high level and low level. And the idea is that the landing craft would have to come in at high tide so they'd get closer into shore. That way then that they wouldn't have so much firing on them when they had to walk or run all this distance on the seafloor. So tides made a big difference, and we had to wait till we had high tides. But not everybody waited. Of course, some of them came in at low tides, so they'd get off the landing craft, and it was still 300-400 yards off the beach, the normal beach. The tides were something that I guess they knew about, but they were tremendous. If you've ever been along an ocean shore where the tides are, it's an amazing thing to see.
When you landed on the beach on the 7th, were the Germans still firing on you?
Entirely, just day and night. The infantry company that I was with, as one of the 3 medics, instead of having a total of people serving of 140, the normal of an infantry company, it was down to like 70 or 80. And of the 3 medics that were assigned, of which I was one, we were down to just 1 medic, sometimes just me. And when I got hit and went back to the hospital the first time, they had to get a replacement in for me. So the taking of lives during the first 3 months of fighting in Normandy was beyond what anybody thought it was going to be.
Was there mass confusion when you landed?
There was mass confusion because a lot of these troops that went in, the U.S. troops that went in the first wave, never got off the beach, and they had a high number of wounded. The landing craft that went in were supposed to be the ones that take the wounded out, but because of the high tides, sometimes by the time the landing craft got in, the tide would have gone out and they couldn't be beached there. They had to stay with the water, so they'd move back again out, and they never could always be assured of having a full load of litter-based cases to go back onto the ships. It was a tough place to land, and that's why the casualties were so heavy.
The Germans had a lot of obstacles on the beach to slow you down. What were they?
They had armed the beach well before D-Day. At low tide, the water would be, 300-400 yards. well, 300, off the normal shore. The Germans would install these telephone poles and other pieces of steel like a wigwam, 3 or 4 of them in a bunch, and place them right on the ocean floor. And the idea was, well, at low tide you could see them and they weren't hurting anybody. But at high tide they'd be just covered, so a landing craft that was coming in would hit these things, not knowing where they were, and that would strike a opening in the landing craft. So that was one of their tools to keep people off the beach. So that's where a lot of the confusion came to.
Did you see the Rangers climbing up the cliffs?
I could see them, but the bulk of them went up before we got in. So the ones that were reinforcement groups that climbed up, and that cliff right at the beach was 120 feet off the water and virtually straight up, and going up that cliff was something too. Now the Ranger Battalion was not part of the 29th, but it was parts of it were attached to us to climb that beach. We knew that cliff was there, and we knew that to get to high ground, because when you're on the high ground, you can see all over then, and you can direct your incoming artillery fire with better observation and so forth.
The French countryside was filled with hedgerows. How did you get through that?
Well, the hedgerow country consisted of the 25 miles from the beach to Saint-Lô. Once you get beyond that point, the layout of the land changed. The French had orchards built between Saint-Lô and the sea because it was a great country for raising apples. And so they had their little farm plots of 2 or 3 acres that would be enclosed on 4 sides by these hedgerows. And those hedgerows had been there for 1,000 years. So the trouble is, we knew they were there, but we didn't have any idea how to get through them. And getting through them was a real tough deal. And once you got into the gate that led into this farmer's field, you would put a whole platoon or company of infantry in there, maybe with 1 medic like me with them, and we would stay in that field until we had orders to advance further forward. Well, we couldn't come out the gate and go up the road because the Germans had that all zeroed in. We had to go over the top, and these hedgerows were shaped like this, and they were probably 10 feet from the ground down here to the top, and you had to go over the top of them. One of the great solutions that somebody figured out was to have some American tanks come in, and they took some of this steel work off the beach that the Germans had erected. Those down on the ground, and these iron things were a V shape that were welded to the underside of the tank. The tank would get these, come into where we needed to break down a hedgerow, and drive like hell through there and put these prongs into the hedgerow and keep pushing, and it would bust a hole through. And that's the way we solved the hedgerow problem. But it took us 2 or 3 weeks to come to that conclusion, and that's why we didn't make much progress.
The progression was to be 25 miles in 7 days, but it ended up being 7 weeks.
The Germans had strong defenses, and they kept falling back. They were falling back into their prepared spots, whereas we were moving forward into spots that were in the wrong place, because these farmlands were separated by these large hedgerows. And if you're going this direction, you're on one side of the hedgerow, dug in, and the other guy may be a hedgerow back, but he's on the other side. So when you move forward to take his position, it's always on the wrong side of the hedgerow. So you had to keep digging in as you, and that was the one thing we had to do every night. Is if we moved up 300-400 yards or something like that, we had to dig in, so we had a safe place to sleep that night. Nobody had tents. We slept in open holes.
As medics, you didn't have a mobile hospital per se, so what did you do?
I was attached to what was called the Battalion Aid Station. This was a medical group would take over like a farmhouse or a barn or something and set up medical procedures in there if possible. And there'd be one doctor involved, and there'd be maybe 25 medics that were attached to the Battalion Aid Station. That was theoretically where I was attached. But I was assigned to the infantry companies, which were out ahead at the front line. And we would be three of us medics assigned to a company of infantry, which was like 140. And we did not have weapons. We carried medical pouches on our side, and we would dig a foxhole every night, just like they would. We would have no weapons, and when one of these infantry guys that were living right with us, they'd say, "Hey, Doc, come out here, I've been hit." So you'd go over and find a guy and figure out what his wrong was, patch him up the best you could, and call back to the Battalion Aid Station, and they would send the Jeep up to where this company was, pick up the wounded, put them on litters, and strap them to the hood of a Jeep and take them back to the Battalion Aid Station, where they would get medical attention from a doctor. So that was all we did, was just emergency treatment to stop arterial bleeding, put compresses on as tight as we could, and call back and tell them, "Hey, come up and get this guy. He needs immediate attention." Sometimes, before the Battalion Aid Station could get the Jeep up, because they were busy doing other things, there'd be orders to move out, which meant the whole company, including the 2 or 3 medics that were with them, had to go over the hedgerows and move out because the Germans had backed up a little bit. So sometimes these wounded guys would just sit by the side of the road. Sometimes I'd stay with them, but if the company got ahead of me, I had to leave them and tell them where to pick them up, and they'd finally get them. So I didn't have any fancy equipment to treat them with at all, except sulfa powder I could sprinkle on the wounds and something to put around them to tie them down. So it was very, very basic medical. I didn't have to know the things that the guys in the Battalion Aid Station, who actually treated these guys flat on litters, they were, rather accomplished. But me, my medical training in the States was all of 3 or 4 weeks while in basic training. So, but that wasn't our job. You'd fix a guy up, call back to the aid station, tell them to send the Jeep up, and then the order would come through to move the whole company forward. And the wounded guy would be lying on the ground. And he said, "Hey, Doc, where you going? Where you going? You're leaving me." I says, "I can't help it. We got to move forward. You just be patient." And within an hour or two, somebody would come up and pick him up, take him back. Now, the evacuation system that we started went back through the battalion and the regiment and the division, and they had very good medical treatment all the way along. But the more serious ones, like mine, second one, they'd get to the point where they couldn't do anymore, so they'd take you back to the beach on a litter and lay you right on the sands. In the meantime, they had put some type of steel plate down on the shore, and these C-47 2-engine aircraft would come in and land on a short portion of the beach where the metal mats would be down, and take these wounded guys that the division medics could not handle, like me when I was hit, and put you on an airplane and get you out of there. So I had my first airplane ride of my life in August of 1944 from the beach there.
As part of the Geneva Convention, medics couldn't carry weapons or be shot at, right?
Well, it was an agreement that if you're going to be in battle, and this only applied to the European countries and U.S., each country had signed it, and it was established certain rules of war that would follow to help the wounded and those killed be evacuated. U.S. followed this very closely. We did not fire on any ambulances. We did not fire or bring artillery in on places where the Germans had hospitals. But that wasn't always true with the Germans against us, because they were desperate and were falling back every day, mostly, and they just felt that why should they follow these regulations when it meant their life was in danger? So ambulances and so forth would be marked with a large red cross, and they would be protected from enemy fire. And we as medics wore armbands that had a red cross on them, and we wore those all the time. And theoretically, when we were out in the front lines or out in front of them to rescue somebody, the Germans were not to fire on us. Generally, they did pretty good, but there were many times when they decided to suit themselves that it was better to create some more havoc. But that's why we never carried weapons. Now, the Japanese never even heard of the Geneva Convention. They never signed it, and therefore the medics out there were all armed.
While in Normandy, you received 2 Purple Hearts for being wounded, and then your actions awarded you the Bronze Star?
Well, let's see, three events. 2 involved being wounded. The first time I went back into our territory, 10, 15 miles, and was treated, and within 3 or 4 days was back again. It was a lightly wounded. The second time was heavily wounded when I was evacuated all the way back to England and spent 4 months in the hospital. The Bronze Star was for a specific event that I took part in on my own, of rescuing somebody that was out in the front ahead of those. I was out there as a medic, and I was given, that's the smallest award, the Bronze Star. It's a junior version of the Silver Star and the Distinguished Service Cross. And I got it for going out and dragging in one of our wounded infantrymen back into our lines under rather bizarre conditions. So those were the 3 things I was awarded, and they provided points for me when I was ready to come back. And every time you had one of these decorations or a battle star, you were given 5 points, and each person's record, by the time the war was over in the fall of '45, you were assigned a number of points. And those were the highest number of points that had been over there the longest or had the most decorations would start coming home first.
When you got out of the hospital for your injuries, you left the 29th Division and were assigned to a rear echelon unit that was picked to go to the Pacific as a support group?
We got on ship along with 15,000 others and left Marseille and got off one night in Panama, got back on again, headed toward the Pacific. And as we were going along in the middle of the Pacific, westward toward the Philippines, they dropped the 2 atomic bombs. We didn't even know what they were, but we heard about them, and that cooled things down. But had they not had the atomic bombs, that fighting would have kept on, because the Japanese who were in the Pacific, they weren't beaten by any means. The Germans were, but not the Japanese.
Before you returned from the war, you also spent time in Korea?
It's in September of '45. The war is over. There were a bunch of troops that were in the Philippines that had nobody else to fight anymore. So they were assigned, along with our outfit, to go up 2,000 miles to Korea and take over that country. Korea had been in the Japanese hands since 1906. So they were ready to have somebody come in and take care of the Japs. Now the Japs had surrendered, therefore they were just a matter of putting them together and shipping them back to Japan, and we helped the Korean people then turn their country around. But you know, those people had been at war since, as I say, 1905, and they were so tired that most of them hardly knew what to say.
You served both in Europe and the Pacific. That was uncommon, right?
Pretty much uncommon, yeah. Now, our service was the war was over, but we were still there. And when I look back on the occasion I have as a young man to see the world, Europe and the Pacific, I was glad I went out there. Even though we didn't take any part other than the fact we were there and took occupation duty in the Pacific.
Have you been back to Europe for any reunions?
3 times. The big time was in '94 for the 50th, but I was back when we installed our monument for the 29th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, and then I was back again just 3 or 4 years ago to attend an event over there. So the people in Normandy are really like us, and they really want us to come. And the appearance at the National Cemetery at Omaha Beach is always a big event every year. But that's not true in Paris. In Paris, they don't give you the time of day, and you know, they just considered you as an American. Don't bother us. But in Normandy, we were well respected, and but I won't go back anymore. It's the trip is too long, and it's too hard on you.
Don, thanks for your service and for coming in.
Thank you for having me.